Well, thanks for joining us again, Stu.
No problem.
Always a pleasure to have you on board.
Thank you for inviting me.
So today we're going to talk about a topic that most people might not think is too exciting, but there's a lot of actual detail in it. So it's freehold versus leasehold, things to look at, be aware of. So we kick off with freehold then. So define the term freehold and what it means if you're purchasing a property.
Yeah, so obviously most properties that are built, houses, that type of thing, are usually sold on a freehold basis, which means that technically speaking, you own the right of the land that property sits on.
Yeah.
The actual term is you own right down to the core of the earth, right up to the outer limits of space is the freehold term. So essentially you own the land that property sits on, and you have the sole responsibility for the property. You are solely responsible for the maintenance of that property and the upkeep of that common area.
Yeah.
And the ground.
So some would say it's the sort of the traditional element of ownership. There's two forms of ownership.
It's the
generally.
most common, form of owning a property in the UK.
Yeah, and when you think of a house, lock, stock, front and rear gardens, generally you're looking at a freehold.
Yeah,
property.
Absolutely. There are some anomalies with some of the new builds that are built now.
Yeah.
But most properties are sold on a freehold.
Yeah,
basis.
I think if we talk quite generic today in broad term of freehold and leasehold, because there can get quite a few nitty gritty elements to it. But generally we're going to talk quite broadly today in terms of the generic freehold and leasehold terms for everyone. So talk to us then about leasehold. So explain what leasehold might be.
Yeah, so leasehold is actually more of a UK term, really, to be fair. Not many countries out of the United Kingdom actually do leasehold. So our leasehold is essentially an apartment or usually an apartment where you, in effect, buy or purchase a lease off the freeholder of a property, and you don't own the land that the property sits on. Your sole responsibility is for the internal element of the apartment, and you pay, typically like an upkeep to share a general occupation on that land. Yeah. So you are, you don't own anything really. Essentially, you buy a lease to live in that apartment block. Yeah, is what leasehold is.
Yeah, I think, again, like we say, the historical, traditional route has always been freehold. But when apartments come into form almost, then it's a way of dividing up that ownership of the land, isn't it? So you can't expect...
To kind of explain it, it's like if you have an apartment block of 100 apartments in it, you can't all own the freehold. Yeah. Well, you can. It's part of what we call common hold, but that's a completely
Let's not go there.
It's a completely different thing. But, typically the generic term of leasehold is where you, as part of a group of people, own the lease of that property.
Yeah, and you can't expect Betty from flat 15 to go and mow the lawns and
exactly,
Pete from 24 to maintain the lift.
There are obviously lots of things involved in a leasehold property that typically are part and parcel of owning that, such as service charge and ground rents and so on. That we'll
let's
talk about.
Go into that a little bit then as we're there. So service charge, again, a lot of people, particularly if it's the first purchase, will never have ventured into leasehold or understood how the lease is set up and service charge. So maybe if we start with what can somebody expect in a lease, and then we can kind of go on to the what they can expect from a management company and stuff. Yeah,
I mean, leases are quite complex. I mean, they're a long document, to be fair, and you'd be silly for us to sit here and expect everybody to understand what's in there. Quite frankly, through a normal lease, I probably look at 3 or 4 pages of certain areas of that text, which applies to what I do day to day. But typically, it lays out the contract between the owner of the freehold or the head lease and the leasee.
It's a little bit more like an in-depth AST. So if you rented a property for 12 months, technically, I suppose you're renting a property for 100 years, 120. You're buying a lease.
It's a really good term, actually. It is like a very long rental agreement, really. Although at the end of it, you do have that asset which you can sell on, and make money on. But it will lay out, the purchase price of what you pay for the property, who the freeholder is. It'll talk about how long you've got left on your term. It will talk about any disbursements or any obligations as a leasee that you need to you're obliged to follow. Yeah, right through to things like ground rent clauses and forfeiture clauses and certain things like that are quite important. But it's quite an in-depth document, really. A solicitor, when you purchase a leasehold property, will go through these when they're reporting to it.
I was going to say some good advice is probably to have your conveyancer look over the lease and point out any, because they are written in quite legal terms.
I mean, obviously, a lot of your inquiries through a purchase of a leasehold will be done from your solicitor. He'll be acting on your behalf, and he'll be raising inquiries on the lease and any sort of anomalies in there that you need to be aware of.
And I mean, things that people don't think about sometimes are the lease can stipulate down to what type of flooring you can have in the apartment for acoustic reasons throughout the block. So again, it can get quite detailed.
It can be, and I think that's when you look about the difference between freehold and leasehold. As a freeholder, you can make any decision you like. You can put any colour, internal, you can do any external decorative work, depending on obviously if you're in a conservation area.
Of course,
but you have the right to make that decision. As a leaseholder, you have to seek permission to make any changes or alteration to a property that sits within a leasehold term, because you need to be able to prove to the freeholder that you're not changing the aesthetics of the building or make any damages to the building that could affect value eventually.
Exactly, you've got a wider commitment to the value and the appearance of the block as well.
I mean, typically the way it worked would be if you were looking to do any work on a leasehold property, you would approach the management agent and say, I'm having some work done. They would either approve it or say, here's a list of approved contractors that we would like you to use. It doesn't mean you have to use those. It's often usually a point where the managing agent would say, we would prefer that you use a list of contractors that we've approved. Moving forward, it's something that I think people don't quite understand with leasehold, is that although you own the property on a mortgage, you don't physically own the building, so there are rules and regulations to take into consideration.
Again, just to simplify it, you own a lease on the internal four walls of that property, really. Okay, cool. And then moving on then to what someone can expect from the lease. So we've talked about a lot of the maybe restrictions or stipulations within the lease of what you can and can't do. What can someone expect from buying a leasehold property that might outweigh the benefits of a freehold for them? And I suppose that leads into then some of the services and management that they'll receive. I mean, there are some really good key positive points about owning a leasehold property. First and foremost, you're not responsible for the communal areas, so you don't have to cut the grass, look after the hedges, you know, the bins and those sorts of things that you would do naturally on a freehold property. Talking about buy-to-let investments, that could actually be a really good thing. You do pay a service charge, which is usually an annual charge, often broken down either quarterly, can be done monthly as well, where you would pay a certain amount of money to the management agent, which is to upkeep the entire building. It's a collaborative effort from all the leaseholders, so of course you're not the sole responsibility for the whole upkeep, but you are, a proportion of your payment will be to keep the building going. So things like insurance, so your building insurance. So again, if you buy a leasehold property, you only really need contents insurance. So you don't need to worry about the building insurance, usually covered. Things like repairs or any maintenance costs will come out of service charge, which is part and parcel of the external building.
Exactly, If there are any sort of pending works that are needing to be put together in the future, that's what your managing agent's there to do, is basically manage the building and manage the overheads and costs over a certain period of time. Which is where service charge can sometimes be either not a low cost, but a cost which could potentially increase in a few years' time, depending on what the management over.
I mean, if you own a freehold house, as Kirsty says, from location, people should be looking to spend anywhere between £2,000 and £4,000 a year on their property. And that's generally just in terms of upkeep, so roof repairs, external repairs, boiler, etc. So actually, when you think about it, if you were running a service charge, and they do vary, but from £1,000 to £2,000 plus, that's kind of in the realms of what you'd be spending anyway on your own property. I know you've done a lot of work on your own property, and blood, sweat and tears. You can't account for that.
I mean, if you look at the typical freehold property, whilst it is quite often seen as the gold standard of buying a property, people want to own their own freehold. Of course, I understand there are massive challenges with that as well. So in the event that you come home one day and there's a huge leak in your apartment or in your house, you've got to sort it out. You're responsible for that.
Yeah.
If if there's a thunderstorm and the roof gets blown off, you're responsible for that.
Yeah.
Obviously you'll have insurance in place, but you're responsible for that insurance. And the regular premium paid every month or every year.
I think what you said earlier about actually if people don't want that lifestyle, it's a lifestyle choice almost can be. So
I would say so.
If you don't want to maintain gardens, if you want to lock up and leave for a few months of the year, if you're a empty nester or a downsizer, you spend some time abroad, it's actually quite a good option.
Definitely. I mean, if you think about where we work in the city centre of Birmingham, it's like if we have somebody that is a high flyer who travels the world with work, they don't want to be able to go away, lock up, not have
haven't
to worry
got time
about
on a
property.
Sunday morning to put mow the lawn.
I mean, I can sometimes not mow my lawn for a week, and I get home and it's up to my knees already, and then I have to spend that hour or 2 hours trying to mow the lawn. But with an apartment or a leasehold property, that's all taken care of. So there are headaches with freeholders, which I suppose weigh up the benefits of buying a leasehold. But then I suppose there's a flip reversal on that as well. There's benefits of owning a freehold over a leasehold.
Yeah. Okay. And then just some, I suppose, terminology that some people won't have heard of. Sinking fund. Mm-hmm. Again, it's something that a lot of people ask about when they're buying a property, or the conveyancers do. Yeah. Just give us a really brief overview of what a sinking fund is.
Yeah, it's the easiest way I can explain a sinking fund. It's like a bank account, really, or a saving account. So your managing agents will have an annual budget, which would be for the upkeep of that building. They'll have a plan in place for any major works that might be needing to be done in the future. So, for example, if you buy a relatively new property, the service charge might be low, but they'll have sort of periodic percentage increases to plan for any future works, like for example, retarmaking the car park could cost £20,000-30,000, which they don't have now, but they'll put a plan in place to obtain that money in the future.
A common one is decorating of the communal hallways, because it has a lot of traffic there,
of course,
from the floor into the walls, and every 4 or 5 years those will be redecorated generally, which
will be part and parcel of owning or managing a building that's leasehold, because they'll have obligations to the freeholder to ensure the building is maintained. Yeah. So that's where the service charges can increase slightly. Not hugely, unless there's obviously major works to be done. But a sinking fund essentially is taking a bit of money which you've paid every year on an annual basis, which is then put into a pot, which then increases in value over a period of time to pay for any of these major works.
Yeah, so it's a bit like a rainy day fund.
It is, yeah.
Put a little bit away each year, and then 4 or 5 years down the road, it means they don't need to come and ask for more money to go and decorate the hallways. Exactly. The plan's already there.
So if you look at that onto freehold then, so if you have a property that does have an issue, you have to pay for it there and then. Yeah. With leasehold, it's been managed, and I suppose the project's been managed, so you don't have that lump sum payment.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. We might touch on that in the tips a bit later. In terms of the lease then, just to, I suppose, finish off on that, length of lease is another question we get a lot. So what should buyers be looking for? What's a standard new lease, and what's the kind of period or the time frame when you should be getting a bit weary about purchasing a leasehold?
Yeah, so leasehold will come with a term. So that term will be how long is that lease for? So in, I'd say, historical leaseholds, they were often 99 years or 100 years, sometimes 125. Yeah. That'd be typically what would be offered. Common now is 250, even up to 1,000 years, 999 years for most new builds, because obviously there's a lot of talk about Leasehold Reform Act and what is a fair lease in terms of the timeline. Mm-hmm. So I think from a point of view of buying a property, there's many options out there that don't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. It just means that there's a different timeline when they were delivered to the market. Yeah. The historical weary line is when it dips down to around the 80-year term. Yeah. Because what we call marriage value comes into effect, which is when the lease drops below 80 years. The marriage value is essentially a term or a premium charge that the freeholder can claim on the difference in value of a property that's got a low lease versus an extended lease. Mm-hmm. And they, in theory, are allowed half or 50% of that increase in value, which is what the marriage value is. But again, the Leasehold Reform Act, which is due out in 2024, is potentially looking to make that process easier for a leaseholder to extend a lease, which would mean that the marriage value would be abolished, and therefore they're making the cost savings than paying a higher premium.
So generally leases would have come at 99 years Then more recently, a lot have been offered at 125.
Yeah, 125.
Then I've seen a lot of 250s as well, 250-year leases.
A lot of the ones we're dealing with are 250, to be fair.
Yeah.
Most of the ones that we are, new deals that are put together now are usually 250. I've started to see a few 999 years, but there's not many of those.
You're going into a realm of share of freehold then, aren't you? Though?
Yeah,
so,
I mean, in theory, the most common leases now that are written are 999 years with no ground rent.
Yeah.
They're a peppercorn, which means in theory there's no value to it.
Okay.
But that's what I think is changing in leasehold.
Leads us nicely into ground rent then. Again, there's been a lot of change in this market. So again, a lot of questions, a lot of moving of the goalposts, I suppose, from a mortgage lender's point of view as well. So just give us an overview again of maybe what was standard practice and what now is the new normal.
Yeah, I think it's like any trend, I suppose. What was acceptable 10 years ago, it seemed that it's completely shifted now, and there's a lot of attention being drawn to sort of ground rents and how they've been calculated. I think there's been a few case studies where there's been some real tricky ground rents out there. Talk about doubling ground rents, onerous ground rents, escalating clauses.
Yeah,
which
ultimately
obviously
aggressively double every so many years.
Essentially could mean that the leaseholder is going to be hit with a huge bill in 25, 30, 50 years, and that's what lenders are becoming quite smart on now.
Yeah.
But also, I think there was an attitude shift as well from buyers that they started to think about these things, whereas before an apartment was a stopgap. Somebody would own it for 5 years and sell it and then wouldn't have it for any longer. Whereas I think people are a little bit more cautious about taking these things on. Solicitors are worrying about their liability insurance. Surveyors are worrying about their liability insurance. Lenders are worried about being repaid on their mortgages. So all these things are churning into this sort of pot where they're looking into all these clauses and making sure that the ground rents aren't, going to be a doubling ground rent or an onerous ground rent.
Yeah.
So most common ground rent that we look at are anything from peppercorn. Most commonly in the older style properties that are say built in the 70s, you're looking probably about £100, £150 per year. Just
describe peppercorn then, because we know that term, but when you say that to a first time buyer, they're like, what? Pepper what?
So it's a question I came up with when I first started. But essentially, a peppercorn ground rent is value of zero. Yeah. So they say
it's a gesture.
It's a gesture of goodwill to say, well, in the olden days, it'd be worth what a peppercorn would be, which is penniless, like there's no value to it. So when you're offered a peppercorn rent, it means that you don't pay any ground rent at all. So
sometimes it will stipulate like £1 a year or something, but they'll never collect that. So it's again,
often,
the gesture's there within the lease, but it'll never be managed or collected.
Yeah, and that's what they're trying to push now. So any new lease that's written, potentially in the future will be offered with a
we've actually seen some new or recent new build schemes come into the market or being planned to come to the market with no ground rent. So it's exactly that. They're going away from what I'm sure you're about to move on to say to almost a free ground rent.
Yeah, I mean the term ground rent is a gesture of rent to the freeholder to pay them a small sum for property sitting on their land, and that's the term ground rent really. I think there's been quite a lot of attention to ground rents because typically what a freeholder would do is they would package their ground rent up to make it look attractive to then sell it to make further funding on their development or sell it to an asset like a pension fund, etc. So the more money that they can bring in and generate on this, the better it is for them and more lucrative for them to sell. So that's why we've seen ground rents that have exceeded £250 per month.
And that's where the lenders have come in and dampened that. Exactly. So it's that middle ground at the moment.
Exactly. So a lot of it is down to lending criteria. So it's about working with the right mortgage broker.
Okay, brilliant. Well, shall we do a few top tips then on those 2 or 3 topics? So in terms of a lease, if you're about to buy a property or looking at leasehold, what would be a few quick tips that we'd give a first-time buyer?
Yeah, I would say check how long's left on the lease.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to look at that. I think The second tip is to understand what the ground rent charges are and whether or not they are increasing or what the actual calculations of those are going to be. And
I think the big thing to look out for there is if it doubles. A lot of lenders are nervous around that. So it's got a doubling ground rent. That can be a real tricky one to get through a lender's
I don't want to be
criteria.
Negative here, but if you did get a doubling clause in your ground rent, you're probably unlikely going to obtain a mortgage, or you'll get a mortgage, but it will be retained until maybe a deed of variation is offered, which is another topic, I'd imagine.
Yeah, of course.
You can vary these things and get them changed.
Okay.
And then obviously looking at service charge costs.
Yeah. Okay.
Which I think is really important, because that's basically the crux.
And also with service charge costs, I suppose, check if there's any Section 20 works, which is almost like planned demands for
exactly.
For
Goes
works.
Back to what we just discussed about a managing agent. Planning for future events at the building. It might be that you're buying at a time where they have planned for works to happen. They've gone out to tender. Section 20 notices is essentially a notice to advise them of works that are coming, and it will change the service charge that could increase quite dramatically to cover for that few years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you for your time, Stuart.
No problem.
I suppose just to reiterate on a few of those bits then. So if buying a leasehold, obviously be careful of the length of the lease. Check the service charge isn't onerous or extravagant at the moment. Length of lease, obviously really important, and ground rent. So obviously your conveyancer will give you advice on all of those things, but really important to be knowledgeable when purchasing. But as well, I think we're saying there's nothing wrong with leasehold. It has its place. And is a huge part of the UK market, so don't back away from it just in case, but do just be careful when going into to a purchase. So hopefully you've all found that really useful. I'm sure we'll have more tips, but any comments, please get in touch and we'll happily put you in touch with Stuart. But until the next time, guys, thank you very much for joining.